Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So this time we're going to be taking a bit of an initial look at mobile development. And so I'm going to be focusing on some general things to be aware of with mobile development, a little bit of code side of things. So I'm going to set up something with a few basic bits of code that you can use as something for testing some things with input there with a mobile game. So we'll have a bit of a look at that. So I've started out with a completely empty project. I have brought in the new input system because what I want to demonstrate is getting a couple of key bits of input from that new input system. Because that's something that is quite easy to work with generally, and talk a little bit about in general stuff with mobile. So the things I'm going to be looking at with mobile will be applicable for iOS and Android. And the thing with mobile development is which platform you're frustrated with is usually going to change at various points in time. There's things about each platform that when I'm developing I love and at times get really frustrated by. Mobile development is quite frustrating at times, and part of that is because of just the huge variety of things between the devices. Another big part of it is just being able to test stuff. So there's a limited amount we can test on desktops, but the input doesn't work the same. You can get close with a touchscreen display, but it's still not the same as if you're working with a phone or a tablet, things like of that. So that's one of the big things I'd recommend as a starting point. If you were doing mobile development, be testing on mobile right from very early on. Because there are some things that you can run into that can really be frustrating. There's a couple of resources I'm going to link to as well that can really help out with that. So, okay, first thing, I want to have a look at getting set up in terms of a few things for user input. So this is just going to be a really basic blank scene. I'm actually going to change this to it just being a solid color. And I'm going to get some UI set up. So I've already imported the new input system and switched it over to that. So I'm going to bring in a canvas, which that will need to be replaced with the new input system setup. And I'm going to set up a couple of controls here. So I'm going to put in a little bit of a panel and debug display. So, because one of the frustrating things with mobile is just knowing that things are working. So I'm going to change this to scale with screen size. Pick my usual resolution, which still works pretty well for mobile. And then a couple of things that want to be logging out. So I'm going to set these up as little panels. And so one of these, it's going to have two text boxes in it. So this is going to be, when we're getting touch inputs, there's a few different things we get. One of the things is the state. So I want to start being able to log out a bunch of these things. So this is going to be label. This is going to be value. So what I'm going to do, my debug display, I'm going to park this down the bottom of the screen. And we'll just make it that is maybe 120 high, even just 100 high is probably enough. And then these individual panels, we're going to have a lot of these different ones. So we're going to have one that is going to be our what's called our touch phase. So that's stuff like begin, end, move, stationary, cancelled, things like of that. So touch phase. We want to have our start, or we might call it start time. We also have generally a start position we can access. We also have our position delta. So we've got a few different things that we can access there, and we'll see how we go about accessing those in a moment. And what I'm going to do is just add in a horizontal layout group. We'll let it just expand and have these fill in. These, I'm just going to mark these as being a darker background like that for actually all of these. And the debug display actually can go back to being like of that. So that's good. And a little bit of padding just to make things have a bit of a boundary and stand out. Good. So then with each of these, so this is going to be touch phase. This will be start time. This will be start position. And this will be position delta. We'll be able to easily add in additional ones as we need. So the idea is just to have these all nicely set up. So this label gets aligned, stretched to the top. Like that. A little bit of setup stuff, but our UI positioning is pretty important, particular on mobile. So that's something to make sure you're considering with mobile. Are you going for stuff being portrait or landscape? Are you wanting to support switching between portrait and landscape? You might find that you need to design entirely separate sets of your UI in that case. So scaling and anchoring can often get us a lot of the way there, but not always all of the way there. So that is something just to be mindful of, that you may find you need to fairly heavily sort of customize stuff like that with the UI. I'm going to align this to the bottom. That looks pretty good. We'll give these a bit more padding on the left so they stand out. And we'll make those bold. Excellent. So it'll just give us a bit of a display of the input that we're getting. So let's set up an object that is just going to be our player. And really what we're focused on is just getting the raw input. So in terms of stuff like gestures and that, depending upon what you're needing, you may find that you need to actually manually do the logic for that. So the values that I'm retrieving are kind of information we can use to be able to do that. So we'll have our player. So they're going to get a player input. We'll link up our UI input module. We'll link up to the camera, so it's got all of that. And we're going to create some actions. Now, I'll call this input config. Now, I'm going to get rid of these player ones because those might be valid controls. And we'll notice if we look at these, it's got stuff for gamepad, things like that, nothing for touch input. So those default ones don't cover touch anyway. So what I'm going to add in for the player is a single action, and I'll just call this touch. The action type is going to change to pass through, and I want to get the touch. So I could get just position, I could get the button state, but I find getting the actual raw touch state gives us a lot more information. Then this, under touchscreen, I can choose, well, am I wanting the primary touch? Am I wanting any of the other ones? Generally, in most cases, we want primary touch, and we're going to say that that's used in the touch control scheme. Now, that information is something that is going to work with, when we're working on a touch screen. You could set up then other ones that are working for, if you're doing desktop testing, but again, there's no substitute for testing on device, in particular when it comes to mobile development. It just is the best way of approaching it, and I would not recommend delaying testing on mobile. So, okay, we've got that. We're going to set up a folder for scripts. I'm going to add in my player controller. So the player controller is going to process that touch input and populate those displays. So there's a few things that they're going to need. So we're going to need Text Mesh Pro, because I want to be able to link to those particular ones. So I want to be able to have Text Mesh Pro UGUI, and I want to be able to have the phase. So display touch phase. I'm going to have a few different ones here. If you remember, we had start time, start position, and delta position. So that's good. So we'll be able to link those up. And as we get the particular ones set up, also explain where they actually, the values sort of correspond to. This is also something where when you get the input set up, always make sure if there's things where it's prompting to fix stuff, make sure you do actually do that fixing of them. So we'll link up the touch phase, the start time, start position, and the delta. And then what I'm going to do is we need to get that touch input. So we would have void on touch. Now we need to bring in the input system. So using Unity engine .input system. So because we're using the send message one, we get an input value. Now in terms of what that value is, so we need to read. So we said it was passed through. So we do a get, and what we want to get is this thing called touch state. But to get access to that, we need to bring in Unity engine input system low level. So this will give us our state. And from this, we can actually get these key bits of information. So our display of touch phase, well, we can go state phase. And so that has the individual different ones. So that's where we can go and take a look at that. So we take a peek at that for the touch phase. Has none, begin, move, ended, cancelled, stationary. So we've got a bunch of different stages there for that, so we can see that information. We can log out the start time. Now this time is relative to time, real time since startup as double. So if you're needing to compare that time to anything, this is what you compare it to, or it's based on. So if the start time, that value, you can check it in comparison to this. That's going to give you the accurate time between when the start time was and the current time. So these times are always doubles, and this is the double version. So make sure if you're comparing, you compare it to this. Don't use something like time.time. Use time.realtime since startup as double. That's what it's based on. We also have our start position. So that's our state, and we can see a bunch of the things we've got access to here. So we've also got access to the current position. So we can get the start position to string and display, and our delta position is equal to the delta, so dot to string. So key bits of information that we need from this. Now, this is something where, okay, we've got that set up, so that looks like, cool, we should be able to have this, get something useful. And, we do have this input debugger, which one of the things the input debugger has is it does have this option for simulate touch input from mouse or pen. And what I have found, there's a couple of things with this, because this setting can actually be turned on in code. That's a thing you need to be really careful with. If you turn on that touch simulation in code, and then you go and run on mobile, your touch input won't work on mobile. It actually prevents it working there. So this, you can turn it on in code, but I would be very cautious about doing that. And if you are doing that, make sure you do that via a check for the device type. So you can do stuff like, okay, well, if system info dot device type is equal to device type.desktop, then you could do something where we turn on that simulation, which to do that, we have Unity Engine Input System Enhanced Touch. And that has within it, you can do touch simulation .enable. So I'm going to leave that off because I generally would recommend turning it on and off only via the setup here. Now, in terms of how well this works, it's a little variable. I've found that it is quite variable in terms of how well it works. So as you can see, we don't immediately get anything coming through. Now we can potentially make it so it's not default switching. We might be able to force it to touch, and then maybe we might get input coming through. But I find that it tends to be really unreliable with that actual touch simulation. You can get it to work, but what I found when I got the touch simulation working with this, when I then took that same logic to mobile, it then didn't work. So I would be generally very cautious about relying on the touch simulation. I would actually go for relying on testing it on device. So that's something where what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, okay, well, if I'm going to test this on device, what do I need to do for doing that? So I'm going to go to build settings here. And so you need to make sure you've got the different modules enabled. So at the moment, you can see I don't have iOS and Android installed. So what I'm going to do is add those in, and then we'll quickly cut back to those being installed. So now that I've got the modules installed, we've got more controls there for the iOS and Android settings. And so first thing, we want to make sure the obvious of adding in the open scenes. But I'm going to actually initially go to the player settings, because there's a bunch of settings here that, while they absolutely matter on desktop as well, they have a couple of other implications when we're working on mobile. So you want to make sure things like your company and product name are set. You'll also find on mobile, it has a bundle identifier that it puts together, or package name. That's something that's important. That's sort of the unique ID for the game. If you do change that at some point during development, that's typically going to mean that then, so say someone's got one version installed, you change that package name, that bundle ID, and they go to install the newer version, they'll end up with two copies on there. So it's usually used as a unique way of identifying the project. Things like the version number and bundle version or build number are also quite important. So these two things, when you're doing development and you're directly deploying yourself on a device, they don't make much of a difference. But when you're providing that build to other people, or when you're submitting it to stores, things like that, those bundle versions and that version number, if those haven't changed, then your build will often get treated as, this isn't new, I will ignore it, I'm not going to try and install it, I'm not going to try and validate it, anything like that. So making sure that your version number and your build version or bundle version changes is a really important thing. Otherwise people won't be able to actually get the updates in there. So those are just things to be mindful of when you're setting up with the builds. So the other thing to be aware of is, so Android is a pretty easy one to build for. Regardless, no matter what sort of device you're running on, you might be running Windows, Mac, Linux, any variant like that, you're generally going to be able to build for Android pretty easily. That's one of the great things about it. iOS is trickier. You'll be able to build, but whereas the Android one gives you an APK, it gives you something that you can actually deploy. The iOS build, which I'll switch to that, when we go and build this is going to give us an Xcode project. It doesn't actually give us a executable. To build that executable, you need either a Mac device, or that's where you need to be using something like the cloud build services, which usually those aren't free. So it is something to be aware of, that iOS is a little bit more involved in generating those builds for you need access to Mac hardware either directly or virtually typically. So when I go and build that, so what I do recommend is always putting your builds in, have a builds folder, and then based upon that, split out by platform. So when I select that, so with iOS, it will go and it generates another project, which I then would load up in this case, I use Xcode. And so then in Xcode, I can build that and then I can deploy that. So it's just something to be aware of. Your development processes can be a little bit more involved with mobile because you've got those extra steps of you building it and then you're deploying it. iOS, it's an extra step again. As I said, mobile in general can be a little bit frustrating, and that's why if you're doing mobile development, be testing on mobile early and be testing on a range of devices. iOS is usually pretty reliable that if it works on one iOS device, it'll work on all of them. Android, while it's really easy to develop and deploy for, has more variation there between the devices. And that's something that I've found where with Android, you want to make sure that you are testing across a wide range of devices to ensure that there's not some odd little edge cases or that you might have missed. That's one of the things just to be aware of with it. So in terms of then what we get with the build, so this is the iOS build folder, we get an Xcode project. So that's something where to then build and deploy this onto a device, we have to actually go and use Xcode for doing that. So that's the thing to be aware of with iOS. So I'm going to then switch over to Android and we'll see what we get with building for Android. The other advantage with Android is if you've got a device directly connected and you're on Windows or Mac, things like that, you can just go build and run. With iOS, you can only do that if you're running on a Mac. So that's, again, another thing that's really handy with Android. You can have your development cycles be a little bit quicker in that regard, which is great. So with Android, we provide the actual file name. So this I will call mobile demo. So we do need to make sure often that there's additional tools, things like that set. So in our external tools with Unity, so we do have things where, so being able to set these particular ones. So with these ones, it's not using the recommended one there. So it says that it's missing. So that's something where we can add that in Unity Hub. So that's something where I'll add that in. So again, by default in Unity Hub, it doesn't actually go and add those in. That is something where you often are going to need to manually add those particular ones in. So if I go to add, and I'm going to add in the various Android tools, so that it'll have access to those. So we'll come back in a moment once we've got those bits installed. Okay, so we've installed the additional modules there for Android, and we'll notice if we go to preferences now, those ones are no longer indicating a problem. So it's just something to be aware of, making sure we've got everything that we need installed. So we can go to the build. So it's going to check various components. Now with any of these things, like both iOS and Android, you can set stuff in terms of minimum versions that are supported. And so SDK versions, things like that, that's something to keep in mind, that you might want to be setting that. You can usually find some pretty good details in terms of what ones are out there, what versions people have. So it's something to be making sure you are checking that. Ideally, we want our stuff to be running on as broad a range of devices as possible. So try and pick versions that are going to mean that as many people as possible can play your game. That's really what we want. We want lots of people being able to work with our games. So once this is finished, we'll have our APK file there that we could then directly deploy onto an Android device. If I had an Android device plugged in, that I'd properly set up for it. So in terms of enabling the authorization, it will usually prompt and ask you if you're wanting to allow that. Then it will be able to directly deploy the build onto the Android device. As I said, with iOS, that's something that we can do. If we're working on a Mac, if we're working on a Windows machine, we're not going to be able to do that. So while that's finishing off generating the Android project, I can actually show you what it looks like on the Mac device. So this actually highlights a couple of things. One of the things is it highlights the fact that there's this little bar down the bottom. So there's controls that I need to switch off. You need to make sure with when you're setting up stuff, there's usually additional settings. Sometimes those will be in Unity. Often they might be in things like Xcode itself for adjusting whether particular displays bars will actually show. But this is showing the input, and we've got our APK file, which is great. So this is showing the input is actually changing. We can see stuff like the position delta updating, start positions as we tap are changing. But obviously we have the issue of where these things are positioned. So that is something to always be mindful of with UI, in particular these days where you get phones, some will have like notches and rounded corners and stuff like that. It's easy to have bits of text cut off. So this is something where what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to move that UI up a bunch so that that UI reliably is going to be able to fit onto the screen. But we've got something that it's picking up the information. We've got phase information, which we can use to pick up whether something is finished. So often we at begin, we might grab some bit of info. You might have something starting to react on the screen. You might only react to stuff when it's in the moved state. Or you could look at the ended state and then ended. You could check and see, well, how much is the position delta? What's the time delta? How long has this been being performed for? That lets you tell if something is a tap or if something is a swipe. Is it a short swipe? Is it a long swipe? You can get that kind of information from it. So there's a lot of things we can do once we have that state information here. And so while we could just use the simple stuff of button and position, I do recommend using the state where you can, because that's going to give you a lot more fine-grained detail in terms of the information, and it's going to work a lot better for being able to actually have UI that feels really responsive. So using stuff like the begin, ended, those different ones, you can work with those. Now, the final other thing that I'll mention with mobile is streaming assets. So streaming assets can be a great location to place files in that it lets you easily add stuff in from external things. So it can be a really good location. In particular, like I use that and have used that with sort of companies for developing games. We want to have easily modifiable location for stuff to be thrown for our own development purposes. So when we're testing on desktop. However, streaming assets gets a little bit complicated on mobile. On iOS, it's easy. On iOS, accessing streaming assets is no different to how you would access them on a desktop. Works the same. Your interfaces are exactly the same there. However, on Android, the default recommended stuff by Unity involves you accessing things by doing stuff like a web request. So the same way that you would have to access things via web, you would have to use on Android. And that means you don't have file discovery, so you'd have to have a manifest. It means that all your file operations there become asynchronous ones. And that's a headache. Thankfully, a wonderful, wonderful person has made, and I'll put the link to this in the description below, Better Streaming Assets. This is a free add-on for Unity, and it is a drop-in thing that what it means is that you access your streaming assets through it, and it will work whether it is on desktop, whether it is on Android, whether it is on iOS. It presents the same sort of interfaces that you would use for normal system I/O. So being able to check if files exist, being able to find out files in a folder, So it just has all of those same interfaces, reading things as bytes, reading things as text. All of those interfaces are there and they work. So you write it once using this. If you already got streaming asset stuff using the system.io stuff, there's very little you need to make in the way of changes for using this. I'm using this on, or we're using this on Heave. It was a genuine lifesaver. This was something that just is a huge time saver. Cannot recommend it enough. It was something that dropped it into the project and it just worked. And it worked flawlessly. So better streaming assets. Highly recommend it if you were doing anything using streaming assets. Make sure you use that. It will make your life so much easier, so much less stressful. It's also important on mobile to be aware that we won't have necessarily the same access to write to locations that we do on desktop. Desktop tends to be fairly permissive in allowing you to write to different locations. That can vary if you're doing something like a signed Mac Store app, or potentially Universal Windows Platform app, but in general, on desktops, it's often a lot more permissive of where we can write to. That's not the same on mobile. So on mobile, you want to be a lot more cautious about where you're accessing paths. So use things like your application.persistent data path. So that is always going to be something. So if I log that out, application.persistent data path, that's always going to be a safe location where you can be writing information to. Safe location to store info. If you need a folder structure under that, I recommend using system.io path combine, because different platforms have different ways of structuring folders. And so if you use path combine, you can just use, okay, well, let's say the folder name might be save files, and then it might be slot0.save. So that is going to give us a file path that, regardless of what platform we're working on, whether it uses forward slashes, whether it uses backslashes, it's going to give us a path that is correct and works. So if we run this, you can see, gives us the correct path there. Now it is mixing the cases of ones, but that's going to be okay. It will be able to handle that. So useful thing to be aware of when you're working on mobile. Make sure that you're using the built-in methods for the different paths, because things are stored in different locations. And keeping in mind where you might have write access to is going to be heavily restricted on mobile. So just to recap, touch side of things, this app has been set up so it's something that's a fairly simple one. You should be able to deploy on any device and see some basic output there. So it's something where you can test if that output is working correctly. We've sort of seen the stuff for, okay, if we need to build these additional modules, we need to make sure we've got installed and set up. If we're building for Android, then regardless of what OS pretty much we're running on, we can build it, deploy it, run it very easily. If we're building for iOS, what we get is a project. If we're running on a Mac, we can then directly deploy that pretty easily. If we're not, we need some access to Mac hardware, either directly or in the cloud to build. So just to be aware of. And we talked a little bit about file paths. So if you're doing streaming assets, use the Better Streaming Assets add-on for Unity. It will make your life 1,000 times easier. And be mindful of where we've got access to write-wise in terms of locations, because that will vary from device to device. So that's the main stuff that I want to cover initially now for mobile. There are going to be other areas that do want to look at for mobile. So if there's areas you're interested in seeing more on in particular with mobile, then chuck in a comment below, because it's a pretty broad field of areas that could cover. So I'd love to know what would be areas that are going to be useful to folks. Thanks, folks. Hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you have, chuck in a like and subscribe. It's always really appreciated. If you're looking for the code for the project, I've put that in the description below. There's a link. Also put a link to that Better Streaming Assets add-on. Again, recommend that massively. It's going to be hugely beneficial. In the description, there is also a link to a video archive. So I've started setting up on my website an archive of all the videos that you're able to search and look through. So if you're looking for something on a particular topic, it's a little bit easier to find them potentially just looking through a giant list of videos. So they're categorized and they're searchable based upon the descriptions. If you've got any questions, chuck in a comment below. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon, and there is a link to that in the description below as well. But until next time, bye.